I was just told that because we have Mark Leonard, I would like to welcome you warmly to the meeting, to our meeting. Mark is ECFR director, and we are, I understand, waiting for Wolfgang Ischinger because the plane is late. So you think you can entertain us in the meantime with your introduction, and then we will, because if we postpone everything, then we have problem with timing, okay? So I will just, in a second, give you the floor. So here we are, just for the colleagues and those who don't know, we made AFCO an open platform for the debates on everything that is related to the fact that UK has notified its intention to leave, and one of the issues also which is important is related to the future EU-UK cooperation on security. And we have the European Council of Foreign Relations representatives here because there was a study done by the ECFR, which I understand which is already finalized, and we are interested as European Parliament also to listen to the results of your study. As we also know, the future cooperation on defence issues, on security issues is in the EU guidelines for negotiations. It is also it has also appeared very strongly in Madame May, especially in Munich, in her speeches, but especially in Munich speech, where she was also insisting on this sort of mutual interest or reciprocal interest of cooperation in the area of security. So we understand this is one of those issues where both sides see value added of having cooperation also in the future. So I would just, without further ado, I would like to ask Mark Leonard to maybe open the presentation of your findings. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Danuta, for inviting us here. It's a great pleasure to be able to share the findings of our reflection group on keeping Europe safe after Brexit. What I'm going to present is a result of a research process which was led by a reflection group including four key players: Marta Dassù, the former Italian Deputy Defence Minister; Wolfgang Ischinger, who's going to join us in a few minutes, he's the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, but was also German ambassador to the US and State Secretary in the German Foreign Ministry, amongst other roles; and Pierre Vimont, who was also a former French ambassador to the United States and the head of the External Action Service; and Robert Cooper, who is the Director General for Politico-Military Affairs at the External Action Service. We had a team of researchers working with them from lots of different member states, but also from who had experience on the key aspects of European security. And the report, which is available, is called Keeping Europe Safe After Brexit, and it tries to look at security in the broadest sense of the word, looking not just at military capacities and defence issues, but also internal security, cyber, and other areas. The discussion which we had within that group was not about Brexit generally, but I think that everyone involved in the group did share a basic approach to the topic, an understanding that as a result of Brexit, the European Union does need to defend itself and the acquis communautaire, and that there has to be a difference between being inside the European Union and outside of the European Union. But I think the group felt very strongly that the area around security is sui generis and is different from a lot of the more internal aspects of the EU's relationship with the European Union. And our work started with a sort of very well-known external context where you have a mix of really quite troubling instability, Russian subversion and intimidation from the East, the asymmetric threats and instability coming from the south and from the Mediterranean, economic and strategic competition from China and other emerging powers, immigration and integration pressures linked to climate change, conflict, resource security, the challenge of cyber threats, the growths both in scale, impact and complexity of terrorism, cybercrime, organised crime. But more importantly than that is a background where we're seeing a massive redistribution of power across the world and a sustained pressure on the multilateral international security order, which includes rising doubts about the role of the United States as a guarantor of European security under Donald Trump. And I think that led the group to want to start with a principled position of thinking about how we can actually put security first and to think about security before getting involved in principled discussions about the institutions. And so I think there are three sort of main principles which inform the work of the group. The first is that there needs to be a will to overcome obstacles. EU and UK leaders have indicated a willingness to cooperate on security after Brexit. But there are a lot of obstacles, both political and institutional, which are making that very, very difficult. On the UK side, there are well-known domestic political divisions caused by Brexit. But on the side of the EU 27, the rules approach, which was perhaps exemplified by Michel Barnier's November 2017 Berlin speech and reiterated in the European Commission's March guidelines, risks poisoning future relations with the UK, which sees the Brexit process as a negotiation. The stark fact is that the UK cannot participate in the EU's security decision-making processes if it's no longer an EU member state. Its presence would mean that the body concerned was no longer an EU body. But that being said, the group felt very strongly that we should try and work very hard on security and see it as a sui generis area, which leads to the second principle, which is the idea of moving towards a special partnership. There has to be a difference between being a member and being outside, and the UK's involvement shouldn't undermine EU consensus building. But we believe that UK participation in EU security and defence activities ought to be based on a special arrangement or an enhanced third country status that facilitates UK-EU cooperation, even if it doesn't involve formal involvement in decision-making. The unique status of the UK as a former member of the EU, in fact, should be the justification for this special partnership, and it doesn't need to set any precedent for other third countries. This should be considered as a mutual guarantee of independence because although the convergence of UK-EU interests in security matters is very clear, there could be cases in which a common EU response may contrast with the UK's and vice versa. But we felt that the UK can't seriously be involved in any cooperation without assigning to it some rights to participation in the EU's bodies. And the UK, from its part, is going to need to earn this right of participation through active contribution to collective European initiatives to dispel any fears about the possibility of it free riding within this cooperation. This leads to the third principle, which is the idea of institutionalised cooperation. We think that the EU has to choose between having a plug-and-play approach of tactical cooperation or a more institutionalised way for the UK to take part in EU discussions. And we felt strongly that the latter would be more fit for purpose because it would disincentivise side channels and ad hoc bilateral cooperation. The group felt that if too large a proportion of discussions between the UK and the EU take place outside formal EU structures, it would run the risk over time of diminishing the apparent value of discussion within EU structures and exacerbate a tendency which has already been there for a while towards operating through informal groups such as the Quint, which includes the United States, France, Germany, Italy, and the UK, which is something that a number of member states are very concerned about, and we got that message very strongly from our discussions in different capitals. The second reason we felt that we should opt for a more institutionalized approach is that major EU policy initiatives such as the Iran nuclear deal or the sanctions on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine emerged out of a sustained dialogue between EU partners, which could take place within these informal structures, but is unlikely to be possible if you just have episodic discussions. On foreign policy issues, it's clear that UK representatives and staff are going to leave the European Council and its dedicated foreign affairs bodies like the Foreign Affairs Council, the Political and Security Committee, working groups, etc. But nothing prevents the EU Council from inviting the UK to find new working methods with its bodies where it deems them to be useful, and on specific tools like sanctions or files like nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. The search for a common effort with the UK is essential. Policy coordination on these and on other dossiers could take place through regular meetings between the UK, EU and member state representatives to prepare positions in EU delegations in international organisations or in third countries. And there are a lot of existing formats which could be used to do that. So those are the sort of three core principles which I think come out of the work. And we also made a number of recommendations about how this could work in practice. The paper outlines just how much is at stake in getting future security cooperation between the EU and UK right. And we felt that that would be much enhanced with a framework which could underpin the specific arrangements in different areas. So now that Wolfgang's joined, I'll mention a few of the specific points in it, and then he can pick up the discussion after that. The UK has proposed a treaty on internal security and law enforcement, and we believe that that proposal should go ahead. Such a treaty is necessary to maintain not only the deep links between the UK and the EU on issues from cyber to police cooperation to intelligence sharing, particularly intelligence around sanctions, but also to maintain the speed of communication in those fields. And a new pact should also envisage ongoing political cooperation in relevant areas of internal security, rather than simply naming and enabling specific current aspects, because the picture is not going to remain static. But a treaty will take a long time to conclude, and the dynamics in the EU-UK relationship over the coming months are not necessarily going to be conducive to developing the deep trust-based arrangements that are needed for this long-term security partnership. So we felt that a transitional arrangement would be best, as foreseen for the single market, where current provisions stay in place and apply from the date at which the UK leaves the EU, allowing uninterrupted continuation of the European arrest warrant, data exchange, as well as seconding of UK staff to Europol. For external tools in foreign policy, defence, crisis management, aid, we think that ad hoc arrangements are going to be more appropriate and should operate on the basis that EU states should seek UK involvement where they think it would be useful. At a more detailed level, there could be a search for creative solutions like having regular coordination meetings between UK and Council preparatory groups like COPS or co-repair, and with the EDA, coordination meetings with EU ambassadors and the UK at the United Nations on Security Council matters and on other issues, as well as specific coordination meetings on sanctions and development aid. We feel that the onus is very much on the UK to demonstrate from the outset that its intent is to contribute actively in these forums, both within the EU but also in non-EU settings, such as the European Intervention Initiative, because we think that all channels of European security cooperation at a bilateral and multilateral level should be kept open and be seen as a way of complementing the EU structures. And that also leads to a sort of specific idea on the defence industrial side, where the report makes reference to the letter of intent group, which could be a forum for providing ongoing collaboration between the UK and other EU member states on joint defence industrial projects from the point of conception We think that if the UK demonstrates goodwill in that setting, it might be possible to envisage access to the European Defence Fund and more structured cooperation within EU structures in the future. That's the core principles and some of the ideas which the report lays out. We can go into more detail in the discussion, and I think Wolfgang is going to maybe give a more detailed perspective which draws on his many years of experience as a practitioner.
Thank you, Mark, very much. Good morning, Ambassador. I would give you the floor now. Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I apologize first of all for showing up a bit late here this morning. It was, as happens so often, a delayed air. Oh, I'm sorry. This one. It was, as happens so often, a delay in the air traffic. So I apologize. Let me, in the interest of a discussion, let me be very brief and add just a few points. My first point is that our foreign and security and defense environment around the European Union is today of a nature which does not allow us the luxury to have longer-term uncertainties about the scope, the quality, the composition, and the thrust, and the capacity of the European Union to be a credible actor in this entire field, from simple foreign policy decisions to the question of military missions, if you wish. This is why I personally believe, and I think this thought comes out in the paper we've prepared, that the issue at hand should not be regarded as yet another one of many items to be negotiated in the difficult, understandably difficult Brexit negotiations. I think this is a separate case and of such enormous strategic importance to the European Union that it is good that thought be given to how we in the European Union can tackle a discussion which, in my view, should start soon, should start rather sooner than later with the United Kingdom, more or less regardless of where exactly we stand with the Brexit negotiations. So let's not create the impression among our partners and adversaries around the world that we don't know what we want and that there is uncertainty about whether the UK will be inside the tent or outside the tent in terms of foreign policy and defense in the future. Point one. My second point is equally straightforward, and it may sound banal. I firmly believe that it would be wrong if we looked, as we look for how to shape our relationship with the United Kingdom in the future, it is wrong to take existing third country arrangements as models. Why would that be leading us in the wrong direction? As it happens, the United Kingdom is, with the exception of France, the only country in the European Union that is both a nuclear power, a member of the Permanent Five in the United Nations, and also, obviously, of course, a member of the G7. It is therefore of a totally different strategic nature whether the European Union has a meaningful and operationally useful relationship on strategic defense and foreign policy affairs, then, excuse me, and I don't mean this to sound condescending, then if we discuss other third country arrangements, such as, for example, Norway or Switzerland or others. This is a special case, and this is why it deserves a different kind of approach. My third brief point is regarding the possible structures. I think it is right, and this is one point we make in the paper, not to create, if we can avoid it, not to create new structures, new committees. If I may just make one little point on this. I was personally involved in many attempts, both in the history of the European Union, but also in the history of NATO, in attempts to organize meaningful relationships with third countries. The worst example in which I participated is at NATO, what we call the NATO-Russia Council, which was built with the best of intention. President Yeltsin at the time was told, this is the place where we will coordinate and where Russia will find a place and will be part of the family. Well, that, of course, has never happened. So I would caution against creative new institutions or committees. I think we should start our discussions with the question of to what extent can we use existing forms, whether they are formal or informal, to bring Britain as close to the table as is possible for someone who is not a member of the Union. Madam Chairman, I think that essentially covers the points I wanted to make. Let me just underline a point Leonard made in his initial remarks, which I think is important. The treaty which the United Kingdom has proposed for the area of internal homeland security and law enforcement is obviously something that if negotiated, will take a significant amount of time. That's quite obvious. It is therefore important, and I think this is an operationally important point in our study, in our paper, that a transitional arrangement be agreed early on that would make sure there will be no disruption, even if the negotiation of a full-fledged treaty-like structure may take quite a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, I would like to start now with coordinators, George Shefflin and then Jolainen.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to both of you for very interesting, very illuminating introductions. I have about 3 questions which are, I think, to both of you, but you may want to divvy it up amongst yourselves. We shall see. So my first question, in a way, is to take you upstream of where you began, Mr. Leonard. What are the sources of insecurity? What are the sources of vulnerability in Europe? The fact that we are vulnerable to all the external shocks that you laid out, Russia, Mediterranean, China, immigration, climate, etc., cyber. It seems to me that if you look at it in broader historical terms, we do see more fragmented societies, and for me, certainly, a decline in trust in the role of the state. Also a decline in trust in the role of the market, which means that I think we're in a considerable bind. So in a sense, why is it that sizable swathes of voters are ready to reject the message that comes from the elites and to look for alternatives, whatever they may be, however incoherent they may be, which of course then, if you like, intensifies or accelerates the vulnerability that I started out by saying. The second point I want to make is this special status, a very different kind of third country, as Mr. Ischinger said, for the United Kingdom. I think that given the structure of the situation, that is bound to happen in some form or another, and I think the shape of it is a difficult one. Clearly, the United Kingdom is not like, let's say, Canada, with which obviously the EU has very warm relations, but still it's of a different order, different quality. I've two questions in this regard. Mr. Leonard said that the onus is on the UK, and I think that is right. Having said that, how united is the United Kingdom in having the will to go along with the special status and all the structures that you've been outlining to accept it? I mean, the debates that I read are totally division within the elite in the United Kingdom. And I'm just wondering how your suggestions, how they will play in various different parts of the UK, in which, incidentally, I would include Edinburgh and Belfast. It isn't just London. I don't think I have to explain why. And my last question is related directly to this. Let us assume that this institutional order, the institutionalized cooperation that Mr. Leonard mentioned does come into being. What is its accountability? Is it going to be yet another high-level, technocratic, remote body? And if not, how is it going to be structured in such a way that there are inputs from below? Because if those inputs are not there from below, if there's no identification from below with this arrangement, I don't see it lasting. I don't see it having the legitimacy to survive any serious shock. So lots of question marks for you.
Colleagues, I have to make this statement I usually hate to make, but I have to do it. We have now 7 people that want to speak. If we don't limit ourselves to 2 minutes each, then we will not make it because we have vote at 11. We can have some delay, but not too much. So now, Jolainen, please show how to do it.
Ja, vielen Dank für die sehr interessante.
Thank you very much for this very interesting explanation. Security in Europe is a common good, and security for Europe should remain a common good. I think that's the starting point that we all share. Now, it's become very clear with Brexit that that's going to be much more complicated, much more difficult, and perhaps it will not even be possible because there is no actual political will. What is the UK ready for? Well, will they want to continue to organise security together with other EU member states? And that's my question then. We've already heard that the EU is deciding for itself. There are 27 member states in the EU and they make their decisions. And then we have our common bodies, procedures with the UK. And how are we going to come to common decisions? Will the UK have a veto? And will the UK follow EU rules? If there's a conflict, will they accept decisions from the side of the court? I mean, we have to have special rules and special bodies for everybody. in order to ensure that we can uphold the situation. Now, I think that we've spoken a lot about the transitional period for the internal market and for the union, but we haven't spoken very much about transitional periods for security. And I think that it's high time that this debate takes place gets officially started. I think that has played an important role in negotiations and needs to continue to do so. My last comment, other countries have been worried about the nuclear situation. And obviously the situation for France is going to be very important. And Mr. Ischinger, do you think that France would possibly give up its seat as France to the EU in the Security Council to be able to move forward to having a true EU seat? Because otherwise we'd only have France, and then of course France's seats would be of increased importance after the UK has left. Thank you.
I'd like to explain to our guests that I will give you the floor at the end when all colleagues speak, because otherwise we'll not make it. I don't see any other coordinators wishing to speak, so I can move to ordinary members. Right? So, Diane James.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us this morning. I am a Brexiteer, so I am going to be coming at you from my points in support of that decision the UK took. Can I just remind everybody in this room and everybody watching the web stream that the United Kingdom is one of the few EU member states to meet the 2% defence contribution target, and a number of other key member states have never got anywhere near that. The Prime Minister also confirmed in her Lancaster speech her wish for close collaboration on defence and security. And whilst I appreciate the comments from my colleague Mr. Leonard, I think the aspect that security and defence often has to be held in very, very confidential terms, and I think we have to respect the fact that there are certain instances where we would not be able to discuss matters, because why give away that information and therefore add to the security threat? But what I am going to talk about very quickly, and I'm going to ask the question, we now have a clear threat to the Galileo project, led by Martin Schellmeier, instigated by a German clique. This is in all of the press and all of the media. This is a key aspect of the security and defence systems that the European Union relies on, and yet you want to exclude the United Kingdom. I find it absolutely bizarre that a key component of what actually guarantees defence and security in this country and in this continent is being excluded. So can we have, for instance, if we're going to have a debate, let's have a very clear debate on what is a key component which is on the table at the moment. And can I ask the gentlemen that have come to us this morning, can you give us a comment, please, on how important that programme is, whether the European Union can replicate it excluding a key contributor, and how much it will impact on the security and defence of the European Union remaining states if the United Kingdom is forced to walk away and 1 billion of the budget is forced to be repaid? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to say that we also have to know the rules, for example, for Galileo, before we speak, I would suggest. And Martina Anderson.
Thank you both for the presentation, and I just want to state at the outset that many would know in this room that our group in the Left GUE NGL would be opposed to a European army, and we have expressed our concerns with regards to the common security and defence policy as it has been presented. I would like to tease out what you said with regards to the special partnership and the British establishment needing to earn that kind of cooperation, and to reiterate what was already asked about the difficulties that that would have in the context of the British government not being able to cooperate among themselves in a British war cabinet that is attacking each other and their Prime Minister. And, whilst references have been made to Belfast, of course, there are difficulties in Belfast, but the British government is not consulting with Scotland and Wales and hadn't consulted with Belfast when we had an assembly, but that is something in a different manner that we need to sort out. We also need to be looking at and hearing what the Chief Constable of the PSNI had said with regards to the need for a special arrangement for Ireland, so there would be no hardening of the border in Ireland. But in the context that you have talked about with regards to the special arrangement, I think if you have a very different third country status, you are in danger of opening up the case for special arrangements with Turkey, and therefore I would like to know, I only name that but one, I would like to just sort of that to be teased out a bit further. When you mentioned the European arrest warrants, we need to be very mindful of the fact that there are difficulties currently with the European arrest warrants because of Brexit. There have been extradition warrants that haven't actually been able to be implemented and pursued and have gone to the ECJ. Because of Brexit. And I think unless we have ironclad safeguards with regards to fundamental rights, you're going to have difficulties with regards to the European arrest warrants in the context of the fundamental rights, given that the British government has already declared that it is not going to implement the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So you see that here we have got an issue of security with regards to the European arrest warrant, and the case that you're making for a special partnership. I just want to conclude with, I was at an event last night with a number of BMA and doctors and others, and they too are arguing for the need for a special arrangement because of the implications that Brexit is going to have on healthcare and on patient care. So I think that because Brexit is going to have an implication across the board, not just on security, it is unfortunately one of the consequences that we have, and if we're going to have a special arrangement, then we need to be needing to broaden that out and looking at it in a totality, particularly about the need for designated special status for the North to remain within the EU.
Thank you, Martina. Charles Tannock.
Thank you, Madam President, because I'm a guest here today, as it were. I've actually published 2 papers now on Brexit and security, one last year, which focused mainly on the internal security dimensions, and slightly on the external. I was pleased that the British government, in its position paper, decided to adopt one of my recommendations, namely that it will honour its treaty obligations under Articles 42.7 and 222 post-Brexit, de facto, particularly to the non-NATO EU 27 countries like Sweden, as a gesture of goodwill. And I've certainly seen a big shift in the corridors of Whitehall as the clock is ticking, and I fear what I would call the security cliff edge, that time is running out and these things have been left to the end. And if we end up with a no agreement or a train crash, or everything has to agree before anything is agreed, all these things could fall by the wayside, particularly on the internal security side, access to databases like a Schengen information system, the ECRI for criminal records, agencies like Europol, instruments like the EAW and the passenger name records, just to name a few. But Diane James neatly, I'm afraid, ignores the fact that under the British government's red lines, it excludes any kind of ECJ supervision, which are essential in some of these particular instruments and databases, and the issue of data protection. And I know the government is now trying to do a very fast catch-up on data protection, but it's quite understandable, given the rather rigid rules for third countries, which the UK will become, that things like Galileo and these instruments will be very, very problematic. Now, this year, I have published another paper, and I will hand out some copies to interested members of the audience who want one, on my solution is a kind of going back to the future, as it were, I've suggested that we will need a new structure to give the United Kingdom the true status it deserves as a major military power alongside France, P5, nuclear power, namely to reinvent what was sadly dissolved because it was felt to be obsolete back in 2008, the Western European Union, which predates both NATO and the European Union, and would give the UK a seat at the table on a level playing field with the PESCO 25, with countries like Norway, other friendly states perhaps in the future like Ukraine and Georgia, but excluding, of course, authoritarian countries like Turkey, which is very problematic. Certainly, my conversations with some of the populists in this Parliament, including those from Diane James's former party, is that they wish to destroy all multilateralism as a long-term objective, starting with the European Union and moving on to NATO, WTO, UN, etc. So I think, if anything, we have to recreate structures which are robust and serve the security interests of our citizens. It's perfectly obvious that nobody during the referendum campaign on Brexit ever said that British citizens' lives would be endangered by the Brexit process. I have to say that defence and security very rarely featured in the conversation beyond the ludicrous scaremongering by Diane James's side of the debate that there would be an EU army which Britain would be forced to join, and that eventually it would be used to invade Britain one day if we didn't comply with EU regulations. But beyond that, it really didn't feature at all. But now, of course, it is an urgent issue. And I think, given the red lines, given the paucity of time, but obviously the goodwill that's now been generated by the Prime Minister's speech at the Munich Security Conference, which Dr. Ischinger chairs, and other speeches, there is a need now for a deep and special partnership treaty. I'm very sceptical that there is an appetite for such a formal treaty from the EU 27. I think that Britain will be more isolated geopolitically and in terms of security. It will only have third country status, I'm afraid. No more. I mean, why should Britain have a stronger status than, say, the US or Canada, which are NATO member states? Britain will remain in NATO, of course, but in terms of EU cooperation, I don't think anything can be done very quickly. So let's see what happens. But what we must avoid is some kind of security cliff edge, whereby Britain literally is cut off. Obviously, our intelligence services and the counter-terrorism group operating out of the Netherlands will still operate. That's intergovernmental. But I do worry about all the databases and the kind of day-to-day issues which help our jobbing law enforcement officers, our immigration officers, in things like access to the databases. But in the wider perspective of having an EU defence cooperation with Britain, which is not part of NATO, I don't think that European pillar within NATO would work for obvious reasons. But I've suggested reinventing the Western European Union. I have a long paper here I think some readers will find interesting because it's also very critical about the whole of the Brexit negotiations to date, and I will hand out some copies. But I think that informally it's going to be very hard to recreate. I flagged up in my initial paper the idea of having an observer status for a British ambassador before the Political and Security Committee for the CSDP. Even that, I'm afraid, didn't fly with the EU 27. So getting that close was already deemed to be too close. I think the fact of the matter is that the EU 27 regard Britain as the one that's slapping them on the face, leaving the club, walking away, and therefore it has to accept the third country status which it has chosen for itself. And to go beyond that is going to be very difficult unless we reinvent some new structures.
Anna Gomez.
Yeah, our Brexiter colleague made my day because it was really a treat to see a Brexiter actually regretting that the UK had excluded itself from Galileo and much more. My questions to our experts are whether indeed they believe that paradoxically we may end up with a Britain more cooperative with European security and defence action, albeit outside the EU, out of sheer need. Because, of course, Britain, despite being an island, is actually dependent on partners like even France, in particular, even to manage the internal security, the migration issues, and so on. I'd like as well to ask Ambassador Ischinger and Mr. Leonard, what do you sense will be implications for cooperation at the UN Security Council? Because we're talking, of course, one of the permanent members. Of course, if you can envisage in a post-Trump era, indeed, the EU would actually, it would facilitate with only one permanent member to kicking off the process of reform of the UN Security Council and putting the EU at the UN Security Councel. And then also the implications for the nuclear program of the UK, because of course when you I mean, it's totally different if you have to support it on yourself, and knowing that your security and defence is somewhat also organized in a multilateral framework, be it NATO or also with the EU as it was, or on your own. And finally, a very important question is also the implications of UK being a centre for money laundering, as the Skripal case illustrates. It's not the only centre for money laundering that we have in the EU, but I would say it's the mother of all tax havens, since the father is the US. So what do you think that can mean in terms of, indeed, despite all the measures that are being hinted by the UK Parliament to address this question exactly because of the Skripal case, if indeed the isolation would prompt the financials, the economy of Britain to be more and more dependent on this kind of obscure financial arrangements, and what it could mean not just for Britain but for all of us, because inside or outside the EU, UK remains European.
Thank you, Anna. And Ramon Jauregui.
Yes. Gracias, Presidenta. I will speak in English if you want the two channel. Yo querría decirles...
I wanted to say... I'd like to ask 3 questions. The first is to do with the agreement. Unfortunately, the microphone has cut. It's back on. It seems to me quite obvious. I think that Brexit isn't giving us a debate about who's going to need more from whom. Just looking back at the past century, just looking back at what we've had to do together, I think that the United Kingdom and Europe, as the ambassador was saying, have a lot of joint needs. And so I think in this area we need to build a single agreement. The United Kingdom is leaving and we have to come up with a special agreement. But my question is the following. Would this agreement include a commitment for a type of strategic alliance if there are attacks on either one of the parties, similar to the Article 47 in the treaties that oblige us to defend each other? The agreement that we will have to make with the United Kingdom will need to include a commitment on joint forces. That's my first question. The second is in the chapter on the special agreement. Do we have to include internal security? So problems that are to do with the fight against terrorism, that type of thing, and so cooperation in security, intelligence, that type of thing. And then the third question is the following. As the ambassador has proposed, is it really going to be possible to negotiate this agreement in the margins of the other negotiations with the United Kingdom as a result of Brexit? Because it's so obvious that the counterparties, the compensation that we have to set out in the negotiations mean that we have to deal with the package in the same amount of time. I mean, I think that it's a bit naive to think that we can have an agreement on defence in the margins of the rest of the negotiations. But the ambassador was saying that as this is so urgent and so very specific, that would be something that we could do. Do you really think that's possible? Those are my 3 questions. Thank you.
And Richard Corbett.
Thank you very much. To try and keep it brief, first I think the general conclusion of saying that you have to keep things flexible at the moment and be open to different solutions assuming Brexit goes ahead is the right conclusion. But there's a couple of things that strike me in the very quick read of the report. On page 37, there's a remarkable sentence which says, "The British elite have always been lucid and pragmatic." I think the last couple of years demonstrates that that is far from being the case. And indeed, on on Europe, one remarkable thing is how the British elite has veered back and forth. Higher up on the same page, it quotes Winston Churchill when in a phase where he was envisaging European unity without the UK. But Churchill himself changed his mind on that. If you look at his speeches as a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in the late 1940s, he'd moved on from that to say there should be European security cooperation, European defence, even a European army with British participation. And that was, in a way, a typical example of how the British elite has swung back and forth on Europe. It didn't join the original coal and steel community, economic community. A few years later, it said, oh, yes, we do need to be in. This has gone on right the way through, and we see it now, again, with Theresa May. And may I come back to the Galileo point? Theresa May's first speech about Brexit after she became Prime Minister contained the sentence saying, Brexit means Brexit, we will not be staying in bits of the European Union. In other words, nothing. Agencies, single market, Galileo, everything Britain had to leave. That was the message the EU received. Now the UK says, oh, please, could we stay in Galileo? And far from the EU being the one throwing Britain out, I mean, it's Britain that has, the British government that took the decision to leave. And the Galileo rules, which the UK adopted as a member state and agreed to, because they were agreed unanimously, say very specifically that a third country doesn't have access to certain parts of Galileo for security and data protection and intelligence reasons. So the very least would be to say, look, sorry, we're leaving, but could we please, after all, would you mind reconsidering that rule which we agreed to, but maybe we were wrong at the time? A little bit of humility might get the UK a little bit further than the arrogance of saying, why are you throwing us out, when it was the British government that decided to leave. And a final point, this general volatility of the British position on so many things, you see it at the moment in general on Brexit. It is still a very uncertain situation politically in the UK as to what it wants. And let's just bear in mind this is a process that is far from settled, and its final outcome is far from settled.
Colleagues, I don't see anybody else. So I just can I also make a short comment and ask you one question, because I understood from actually both speakers, but especially Ambassador, said that we should not move towards new structures, new institutions, and you gave an excellent example of something that clearly didn't work. But the truth is also that UK is going to leave the European Union in a very peculiar moment when it comes to the development of the common security and defence policy and the EU defence in general, because we are moving into this period of establishing new solutions and new measures, new institutions, and there will be a probably step-by-step progress in this area. So it will be a dynamic process from that point of view, not only from the point of view of the changes in the overlapping interests between EU and UK. So this is not about maintaining something we already have, but this is also establishing sort of commitment to something we are going to establish, to create as European Union. Do you see this also as a challenge? So that would be my first comment. And the second question is, when we listen also to negotiators, we often hear that there is a certain asymmetry in when negotiating with UK on many issues, but also here asymmetry between the readiness to take over commitments, obligations, and the rights that they would expect from the Union to give them. We see the readiness to participate and to have a strong sort of high-level structured dialogue on the one hand, but on the other hand, we do not see this sort of permanent commitment, for example, at operational level, but more a cherry-picking approach to an ad hoc approach with regard to the commitment to participate in operational activities. So we see this asymmetry in terms of readiness to accept obligations and get rights, and this probably in terms of if you take into account the time we have for finalizing this kind of cooperation agreement, this is also bringing additional challenge. I don't know if you see this asymmetry also as something visible in the EU-UK approach as we see it here. So I will give you the floor as much as you need. We can't give you all the time you would like to have. We are having voting, but just to comment and respond to the questions would be for us very useful.
But yeah, if we've only got a couple of minutes, maybe I'll just pull out three of the points which I think people were talking about. The first, I think, which is a really important point that Charles Tannock raised, is this danger of a security cliff edge. And I think that that is not something which has entered the public consciousness on either the UK or the EU side so far. The debate has been about other issues. And there are lots of very difficult issues. But I do think that this basket of issues, though it includes incredibly complex ones and some which have very, very close connection with the EU structures through the ECJ and the ECI, but others which are very intergovernmental and which operate according to quite different principles, is different from most of the rest of the EU agenda, because it is more of a win-win space. There are areas like Galileo where you have mercantilist concerns on both sides, which are obviously going to be more difficult to work out. But I think that there should be a conscious decision both to avoid a cliff edge, but also to see this complex of issues as something which is different from other areas, and what the arrangements that are worked out around security don't necessarily either have to create a precedent for what happens on economic or other parts of the Brexit agenda, or indeed for other third parties. Because I do think there is something unique about an EU member state leaving the EU, and whilst it's important for the EU's cohesion to show that not being in the EU is less good than being in the EU, and that you don't have decision-making rights, and to protect the decision-making autonomy of the EU. There's no reason why the arrangements with the UK have to apply to all third parties if the EU doesn't want them to. The second point which I think came up was to do with sort of accountability and rules and rule following. I mean, I do think that, a lot of it, the onus on this is on the UK side, and if there isn't a willingness to find an arrangement that works for the EU around the ECJ, then obviously the internal security arrangements are going to be extraordinarily difficult. But my sense is that even though the UK is divided, these are areas where the Prime Minister is more aware of the stakes and is more willing to be flexible. And I think that flexibility on those issues, if it comes, should be met by a greater flexibility to think about the UK playing a part, maybe not a decision-making part, but a full part in structures from Europol to the AEW, etc. And then the kind of a third issue which came up, which I think was very interesting, was the idea of the UN Security Council, which is goes to the heart of, I think, the bigger background concerns on this, which is that there is a sense that the rule-based order is under enormous pressure at the moment. And we're seeing a challenge from the Russians, from the Chinese, and from Donald Trump and Bolton. And if the European side falls apart at the same time as that, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to preserve that order. So part of the thinking, I think, should work out how to take a lot of the principles that we've taken in other areas and apply them to bodies like the UN, whether it's regular information sharing, strategic planning sessions, cooperation in different forms. And we also think that's an area where it's worth developing some specific practices and creativity. But I'll leave the rest of the comments to questions to Ambassador Ischinger to answer.
Ambassador, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for very interesting comments. And of course, Mark and I, can't possibly respond to all the points made. If I may, let me just add a few footnotes to this discussion. And I'd like to start with a rather fundamental point. Let's go back to our basic strategic interests. The United Kingdom, even before the European Union was created or founded, has always had a substantial strategic interest in making sure that the European continent was hopefully not going to war against each other or creating havoc elsewhere. So there's always been, and speeches by Winston Churchill are the best documents of that long-term strategic interest. In the same way, it is in my view, not a question that we on the continent, those who are currently and will foreseeably remain in the European Union, have a natural strategic interest to have the United Kingdom associated with our interests in strategy, in defense, in foreign policy, as closely as possible, with or without the European Union or NATO or any of the other institutions in which we are all members or participating. So this is why I think that we share fundamental interests, and I just want to underscore what Mark Leonard just said. If we, the future European Union, and the United Kingdom don't regard ourselves together as among those who are called upon to be guardians of what used to be called the West, if we can't be certain that developments in the United States will make it easy to consider the classic Euro-Atlantic community as the West, we will certainly need to be together on this. If we aren't doing that, we would be doing ourselves and our children an enormous harm, I think. So this first point suggests that we should create a firewall between the other elements of the Brexit negotiations and these issues of national and international and European security. If there is a lot of sarcasm and bitterness within the United Kingdom, but also in the discussions, with many of us being extremely bitter and disappointed that the United Kingdom wants to leave, and emotions going very high in the United Kingdom among people who are delighted that finally they can leave, I think these emotions should have no place in the discussion about dead serious issues of national and international and our collective security. So let's have a firewall here. No sarcasm, no bitterness in this discussion. It's too important. That would be my second point. My third point is the status question. I would simply underline the United Kingdom will, post-Brexit, always have a very special status because it will be different in one sense from any other country that may be considered a third country. And that is the fact that it used to be a member of the European Union. Canada cannot claim that it used to be, neither can the United States, Turkey, or anyone else. So the quality of being a long-time full member of the European Union is going to be something which distinguishes the United Kingdom in the foreseeable future from any of the other cases. And therefore, I think it is not a big problem to grant special status without having to fear that others will say, if you give this particular privilege to the United Kingdom, we want it all also. I think there's a good excuse for not doing that. And my last point, since the question was addressed to me about the United Nations and the seats of permanent members and their roles in the as members of the European Union or ex-members of the European Union. Well, let me make two brief remarks. First, of course, both France and the United Kingdom, as far as I understand, have considered their status as permanent members of the United Nations as a status granted to them not as members of the European Union, but in their original national quality. We have developed over the years mechanisms, informal, classic diplomatic mechanisms that allowed it, that allowed intense discussions between the members of the European Union in New York and the two permanent members. But we have, of course, not reached a point where one could say that the European Union has two permanent members in the United Nations. Would that be desirable? Well, from the point of view of a non-permanent member, and my own country happens to be not a permanent member, I think it would be desirable. Is it going to happen? Probably not. Will it be possible once France will be the only permanent member from the European Union? Will it be possible for France to play an even more EU role in New York? I think that's for France to decide. And while I would argue that that would be desirable, it would be desirable, it's a question that needs to be discussed in Paris. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would like to just to apologize. I didn't say at the beginning that the meeting is web streamed, so I hope you look nice and just everything is okay. But you will stay in our files forever in the European Parliament. Thank you for this. I would just like to say also that we use this committee, the Constitutional Affairs Committee, as a totally open platform to have debates on everything that relates to Brexit. And I also would like to thank you in this context for this contribution, because we will be working also on in some months on the consent procedure, on recommendations to the European Union on whether we should accept or not accept the withdrawal agreement. And this certainly has added a lot, I think, to our understanding. And I would like to thank you also for telling those words that Ambassador said at the end on emotions. And I think if we leave very clearly emotions on the side, you also told us there is a rationale for this very clear, strong rationale for having this security cooperation and agreement between EU and UK. So this was very important for us.